Today we're going to look at something that's not new. Every generation, every society, every civilization since time immemorial has been faced with the same issue. But with the digital revolution, and before that the industrial revolution, what we've seen is an acceleration of economic injustice, or if you want to use the word economic exploitation. And economic exploitation or injustice equals entrenched privilege. Now, we like to think of ourselves as a civilised society, especially in Australia. We like to think of ourselves as a liberal Western democracy with a parliamentary system based on a constitution. But we have a number of issues which we face today, which every generation has faced since time immemorial. The excessive concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands. When you see the buffoon, the so-called President of the US of A, surrounded by his oligarchic mates, and you look at Putin, the war criminal, and his oligarchic mates, and you look at the current president of Indonesia, a war criminal, and his oligarchic mates, and when you look at the atrocities and carnage committed in Gaza by another war criminal and his oligarchic mates, you begin to understand that the political, economic, social, environmental, whatever you like to call it, system we are faced with today is moving society backwards. Now let's look at Australia specifically, because that's where I live. This is where I was born. Let's look at it specifically. We have the ridiculous situation where the majority of people in this country are more concerned about celebrating a date or not celebrating a date when this country was formed, while all around us we see the divisions which are caused by those who exercise power amongst us. Divisions based on gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, colour, how we dress, whether we receive social security benefits or not, whether we live in public housing or not. These artificial divisions, which are created to ensure that we fight amongst ourselves for the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table. So economic injustice equals entrenched, and that's the key word, entrenched privilege. And whether that privilege comes from the fact that people have power and wealth, or whether it comes from us. That's right, it comes from us, where we as individuals and communities in this country are much more interested in fighting the people around us, many in the same situation, than actually looking beyond that challenge. And nothing highlights this more than the inability after over 230 years of colonisation for this country's population, whether they've been here for 6 or 7 generations, whether they've arrived yesterday, to actually understand the plight and the situation of this country's First Nations people, and how that plight is basically about stealing land and killing people in order to obtain an economic advantage. This is highlighted as far as Australia Day being celebrated on the 26th of January, where a majority of Australians think this is a suitable day to celebrate this country and what we've achieved and what we haven't achieved. The fact is, if the Japanese imperial forces in 1942 had overrun this country and continued to dominate this country in 2025, I am sure that Australians would find it difficult celebrating Australia Day on the day the Japanese imperial forces invaded the country. So we have this difficulty in putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And to a significant degree, these difficulties are fanned by political movements and individuals seeking political power who understand the best way to move forward as far as their political future is concerned is by stoking fear in the community. Fear of the other. Look at the beginning of World War I, World War II, and any war you'd like to think of. It's about stoking fear in the other. For example, as far as most Israelis are concerned, Palestinians are not human beings, they're terrorists. If you listen to ordinary Israelis being interviewed, they keep using the word terrorist. Do we want to find ourselves in a similar situation? And we will find ourselves in a similar situation where people who challenge the status quo are not just labelled as troublemakers, but labelled as terrorists. We already have the ridiculous situation in this country where people in a trade union can't strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. Individuals can be fined up to $10,000 a day. That if the authorities suspect you may inadvertently have information regarding something that has occurred, as far as, terrorist act is concerned, inadvertently have information, you can be picked up off the street, held for 7 days, questioned, and if you refuse to answer questions, you can be jailed for up to 7 years. And this has occurred in this country because, as far as the Western world is concerned, although we like to make fun of the buffoon in the US of A, our constitutional arrangements are so pathetic, there is minimal, if any, protection for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. Under the Australian Constitution, you have the freedom not to be discriminated against depending on what state you live in, because it is a federation. You have a limited freedom of religion. You have the freedom to receive compensation for assets and land which is acquired by the federal government, and very little else. The situation is so ridiculous. The High Court over 2 decades ago found there was an implied right to freedom of speech in this country only during an election campaign. Without freedom of speech during an election campaign, you could have no free and fair elections. But getting back to the main point, and that's the issue. Nobody talks about the main point. We talk about peripheral issues. We obtain or get RSI of our forefinger liking things in the virtual world. We clap at great speeches and individuals who highlight what's happening. But every day what we see is increasing inequality in this country. When a private charity tells you and me that 1 in 6 children live in poverty in this country, and they need to raise money in order they can go to a public school, we need to think that something is wrong, very, very wrong. When 1/3 of Australians living on social security benefits lead a hand-to-mouth existence, and when you have governments like the previous Morrison government and Robodebt targeting people because they are on social security benefits and calling them leaners, you begin to understand that we have major issues in this country. And it's not issues about race or religion or gender or sexual orientation or the language you speak or where you were born and whether you're a citizen or a permanent resident or a refugee. It's about much more than that. It's about the fact that we, that's right, we as a people have allowed this situation to occur. We have forgotten our history. We have forgotten the struggle that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents and generations have been involved in to ensure that some of the basic things we take for granted, like a universal healthcare system, a pharmaceutical benefits scheme, a public education sector, public infrastructure, social security benefits, were not handed to us by some godlike figure, but they were given to us because of struggle and continuing struggle. We have become spectators to our own lives. We are spectators, like spectators at a grand final or spectators at a tennis match. We are spectators. We refuse to become involved. The 2 biggest tribes in this country are the Gunner tribe. I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do that. An even bigger tribe, that somebody should do something about that tribe. Huge tribe in this country. People hear, they listen, they applaud, they like, and then they turn around and say somebody should do something about that. Somebody should do something about that. Forgetting the fundamental principle of any society, especially one based on representative democracy. The democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It's rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public which are living under constitutional arrangements which protect minorities from majorities. And while we allow wealth to be accumulated by a shrinking number of people, while we allow unelected media moguls in the digital world and the legacy media to determine how we think and how we act, nothing will change. While we are enamoured with celebrity culture, while we worship at the altar of professional sport, nothing will change. And that's the reality that we faced in the 21st century. Now, I can talk as much as I like, and maybe a few dozen people will, look at this YouTube presentations. But the facts are simple. Economic injustice equals entrenched privilege. And if we do not tackle economic injustice by ensuring that each and every one of us share in the Commonwealth of Australia, we will continue to find ourselves in this situation where private charities raise money to send Australian kids to Australian public schools. Extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. There's a federal election around the corner. Most of us will sit back and say, oh, what's the point? They're all corrupt, blah, 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 blah. The fact is, I'm interested in an election, not because I'll be elected, but because you can raise ideas, and ideas which I'm interested in raising during this period where people superficially talk about politics and the divisions which exist in our society are things like a universal basic income, a 1% financial tax, a 1% financial tax on financial transactions. Why just goods and services? A 1% tax on every share that is bought and sold on the Australian stock market, and possibly around the world by people who have Australian citizenship. Things like nationalising this country's natural resources, mineral resources. I am sick and tired of finding ourselves in a situation where we never have enough money for public health, public education, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, public infrastructure, public hospitals, and the list goes on and on. But we see billionaires, Australian billionaires, in the Congo line, which is stretched for kilometres, so they can kiss the ring of the buffoon in the US of A. I am sick and tired of ads by private charities asking for money for public education, asking for money for, asking for money for research, and the list goes on and on. We have the people, we have the intelligence, we have the resources to make this country paradise on earth. But we're too busy fighting for the corporate crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table, too busy fighting amongst ourselves to see who is brushing those crumbs off the corporate table. We're too busy scrounging those crumbs and not involved in activities which will saw the leg of that corporate table so everybody shares in the bounty of this land. First Nations people and the rest of us. So you're faced with a decision every day. Do you let it go to the keeper? Do you put your head down and pay your taxes, obey the law, be a good citizen, complain about all those people who protest, happy with the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table in your direction? Or are you going to rise up, stand up and demand economic justice and demand the end of entrenched authority.